All right, so modernizing the evidence generation enterprise, soup to nuts, what a task. So I'm going to start with Teresa, because you've been part of the collaborations with C-Path for many years across many indications. And the impact that we've been able to realize not only matters to the brain, but to other areas that have come knocking, wanting to adopt the learnings from the brain to other parts of the body. So one of the things that you always remind us of is that what matters is the full understanding of the evidence and how different types of data support key pieces of the puzzle. Can you comment on how you've seen our collaborations make an impact with that?
Yes. So, when we review applications, so I'm with the Office of Neuroscience, and so when we review applications, we do have our requirements for substantial evidence of effectiveness. And that's typically 2 adequate and well-controlled studies, but can be in some circumstances 1 adequate and well-controlled study plus confirmatory evidence. And we are willing, we try to leverage all of the available data to help us make a case for substantial evidence of effectiveness for any drug. When we have nice, clean clinical trials that have clear readouts, that's great. That's often not the case, particularly in neurology. So we really need to look outside of the clinical trials to help bolster the evidence that we see in the clinical trials to help us feel confident in the data that we're seeing, to provide a compelling data package. And overall, I always like to emphasize on telling a story that tells us the story of the science, how the drug works, why we see the effects we're seeing, and pulls it all together. So with that regard, we've been able to leverage a lot of the work that C-Path does through drug development tools to help us tell that story. Often biomarkers is a foundational idea, but we haven't had a lot in neurology in the past, in neuroscience in the past, although we are getting more, and we've been able to leverage that. So the ability to utilize biomarkers for proof of concept, for understanding the mechanism of the drug, to show that the drug is having an effect, and then to take it to the next level and be able to use it to support efficacy and even serve as a reasonably likely surrogate endpoint in some cases for accelerated approval. We rely both on the biomarkers, but also model-informed drug development, which has been a key effort under C-Path that they've been really championing over the last several years, and that has been useful to us combined with the biomarkers to help us be able to better utilize the biomarkers to better inform drug development and put that story together. So I think you've worked on a variety of efforts within neuroscience. I know currently in the C-Pad group, the Alzheimer's group, they're working on tau PET surrogacy, which I think has been doing some really great work to put the story together on how tau PET imaging can be used to better inform trial designs for Alzheimer's disease. And that's just one example. I think I'll stop there. I don't want to I could go on, but
Nobody's stopping you, but we'll get back to that, Teresa, because that's a great setup to highlight why it's important to come together to figure out what are the most suitable tools that will help everyone figure out solutions for bottlenecks in the process, which is the original vision of the Critical Path Initiative, as we heard from Janet Woodcock yesterday. I'm going to switch to Ralf. And Ralf, I'm noticing something that I had not noticed before. You're left-handed.
Just for now.
Okay. You're ambidextrous. That's even better. So, Ralf, with the EMA, we also have a great amount of collaboration. And yesterday we heard from Stefan about the opportunities that lie with the mechanism for scientific advice. But I want you coming beyond the scientific advice mechanism and how we're making all the efforts to set up a transformative data enterprise with EMA. Can you comment on how you've seen the benefit of the collaborations to help the agency move in that direction?
Thanks, I'd love to. So congrats, 20 years.
Thank you.
To C-Path, to Klaus, to Janet and others. I've been with the agency now for some good 17 years, but it's much more prominent and visible how now public-private partnerships and conveners, organizations that are as impactful as C-Path, but are not matched to C-Path, they are much more visible in the influence and output. And while you were talking, I was just thinking how this is now, this story comes out. And if you look at our assessment report for Leqembi, it mentions C-Path. It's not the only one, but let's say the latest one. And I think it's our attempt to make these efforts visible, the efforts that are in the evidence generation. So when you talk about modernizing clinical trials, in my mind, it's the whole clinical research enterprise, let's say, where there are many moving parts that need to be brought together, need to be discussed. We are trying to be systematic about it. We're increasingly involving patients. We're increasingly engaging with consortia and are in a good number of C-Path public-private partnerships, but also a lot of European Union-based. And I think one of the ways we want to further systematize the work is by structuring our awareness of our regulatory gaps. So we've come up with these research needs, and we are better in qualifying the knowledge gaps. We also have identified what needs to be done to move forward in working with the Commission and other funders. There are lots of funding calls now that are directly informed by regulators that lead to public-private partnerships that then, after years, come with solutions that we are implementing. And there's really a joint effort from our director and all the levels to make that more useful and visible. So our director has challenged us to go further with public-private partnerships and to do more as regulators on the global scale in using outputs of public-private partnerships for accelerating medicine development and best use of medicine. So maybe just these examples, I think we can come back, but I totally agree. The picture is that there are in each medicine development, a number of modernized tools in a way, be it the one biomarker or a new assay for an old biomarker, a new analytical method, perhaps in methods that are not even very visible. And one of the ambitions I have is to bring these more out and make it much more visible, to create these stories also from the side of the drug development perspective, and not just the product story, but the drug development tool has its own story.
Fantastic. Because that is something that we've discussed with you, LaShell, as well, quite a bit, regarding, from an industry perspective, how making sure that in the evidence generation efforts, the people that are going to ultimately have the intended benefit are represented in that entire journey. We heard loud and clear the voice of the patient yesterday, but I'll ask LaShell to comment on, from your industry vantage point, what you're doing to make sure that the people that are intended to benefit are represented in the trials.
Well, first, good morning. My name is LaShell Robinson. I am the Executive Director for Global Feasibility and Trial Equity at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And for the past 4 years, really what our efforts have been is, when we think of modernizing medicine, it also is talking about more inclusive research. So starting with the evidence is critical, looking at the data. We can see very, very clearly that certain diseases and even certain medications, after they're approved, work differently based on our genetic makeup, maybe even where we live, different social determinants of health. We have the evidence that says that. And so now what we've done is, really, before we're executing our trial, before we're finalizing the protocol, we're taking a step to really look at who the patient is and ensure that they're reflected in the trial. Now, I know that at times people often think that that actually slows down the trial, but if you really think about that logically, starting where the patient is and trying to make those connections engaging with patient engagement, patient advocacy to really understand the different patient journeys, and even highlighting the fact that oftentimes certain patients are left out of research. So taking that extra effort, really it's not that much extra effort if we think about it, it actually speeds up our trial. We've had success over and over with actually closing those timelines because we're going directly to where patients are, and it has not compromised the inclusion of our trials.
Fantastic. Now, Amitabh, you're looking at the entire enterprise and the economic impacts of modernizing the evidence generation enterprise, not just from the pure industry evidence generation and then the regulatory aspects, but what happens later. Can you comment on how you see these innovations having a major impact, not just on the process, but what happens later?
Thank you, Klaus, and I love your pants. I just wanted to start.
I was going to wear them tomorrow, but since I wore these the first day of the conference last year, a lot of people were asking me, where are the yellow pants? So back by popular demand.
If you have me back, I will wear my yellow pants. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing here, but I'm just thrilled to be here because I study the FDA and the EMA, and I study the intersection of the regulator with industry all the time because my discipline is economics and finance. And so my views are colored very much through the lens of an investor and a person who studies investor behavior. And at the end of the day, if I take a sweeping view of, and I'm going to paint with a very broad brush, what's working in the industry and what's not working, I think what's working in the industry extremely well, and we don't congratulate it enough, is this intersection, right? The regulatory, the quality of the regulatory science that has happened very quietly has been extraordinary. And in particular, I want to mention two things. If you take an example of a pathway that all of you are familiar with, we introduced in the United States the breakthrough designation, right? And that's about 15 years old. The EMA introduced the prime designation. And so what is that? For those of you who don't know, and I know many of you are actually like, you wrote the legislation and all of that. This is sort of the very high level view. Breakthrough is a way for the agency to be involved in drug development at a much earlier stage. So you come in after a phase 1 or you come in after a phase 2 and you say, hey, Takeda or hey, Biogen, this is the way we would like your trial design. These are the biomarkers we would like you to use. And, we've had this in place, but we've never really known what it does. And if you read the medical journals, there's a sense sometimes that the FDA is moving too fast. And by too fast, I mean, at the margin, we're approving these drugs faster than we should have, so they have an adverse safety signal. That's a claim that's often made. Now, it turns out no one's actually evaluated this great pathway. So my colleagues sat down with Katie Miller, who was then at the FDA, and evaluated, let's look at the 60 drugs that got breakthrough designation to the drugs that just missed the breakthrough designation, right? And we can work with the FDA to figure out what are those drugs that the sponsor thought they'd be breakthrough, but then you all decided they would not be breakthrough. So they're right at the edge. And so what do you get? You get that something like the breakthrough designation speeds up development time by 25%. Now, if I was an investor and I'm looking at a discounted cash flow model of like, do I invest in this or do I invest in that? And you bring the revenues 25% closer. You haven't changed the revenue, you just brought it 20. That is meaningful, right? That is just like first order important. And when we did this work, people said, well, but how do you, they went faster, but of course they approved all the non-safe drugs. Well, that's a testable thing. So what we did was we looked in the data because now we have great data. Are these drugs more likely to have higher adverse effect rates? And the answer is no. They could have, but they didn't. This is an example, I think, of the quiet regulatory innovation that has happened that we don't kind of publicize and don't take enough credit for, but it highlights the way forward. There are things that could happen in this room that are first order important for capital markets, because if we go 25% faster and the drugs are just as good, more capital comes in because more projects are NPV positive.
Great. that is such an important point of why these collaborations matter. Because if we provide everyone with tools that actually solve bottlenecks and things can move faster, then that attracts investment. This is what we've seen in tuberculosis that now has a very healthy pipeline, what we're seeing in Parkinson's disease, certainly what is happening with ALS, what we're going to talk about later in the day for some of the kidney indications. But the evidence generation enterprise is not just about what happens with the clinical development stage. And so, Greg, we need modernization and innovation in the translational space.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you very much for having us, and congrats to C-Path and to everyone. So my name is Greg Tietjen. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Revalia Bio, which is a company that's built to do exactly this, try to modernize the infrastructure that we use for human-centered development. Just for a little bit of background that I think contextualizes what we're doing and why. I actually have always worked at the interface of humanities and technology, so I love this metaphor of the story that we're all trying to tell. I have an English degree and trained as a musician before injuries prevented that, and I went on to become a scientist who is trained sort of in the art of interfacial science, so multidisciplinary science, and how do we bring people together. Prior to this role, I was a professor at Yale, where I got the great privilege to work with some of the absolute pioneers of nanomedicine technology, which was really exciting. And about a decade ago, we thought nanomedicines were going to cure all diseases. And then we kept finding that when we would take them out of the petri dish and into patients, that they would fail time and time again. And there was nothing wrong with that underlying technology. The problem is that we were engineering them all in mice and watching them fail when they went into people, right? And what I was very lucky to be right place, right time from some of my mentors, we got connected to transplant surgeons in Cambridge in the UK who were taking non-transplantable organs and bringing them back to life on perfusion systems outside the body. And what's unique about a human organ is it's an autonomous unit. And so if you give it what it needs, blood, oxygen, nutrients, it'll do what it does. So a kidney will urinate, a liver will produce bile, synthesize proteins, metabolize drugs. And so the other key lesson learned, now those transplant surgeons were just trying to make more transplant happen. And they did, actually. This is technology that's now being used clinically. But they also found that 95% of the time, an organ that's donated or a potential organ donor can't donate because they passed away of cancer, fibrosis, PKD, all these diseases that we don't know how to model properly in animals. We don't have the way to be able to tell a really rich picture and complement clinical trials or even be able to get into them. And so what we discovered was, or they helped us discover, was this was an incredible setting to take as an in-between, to go out of the petri dish into the organs to test new therapy. So we took nanomedicines that work beautifully in the petri dish, put them in a human organ. They failed miserably. But the power was, this was now failure that was really relevant. It was catalytic failure because we could learn from it. There was no patient died because of the failure. In fact, even beyond that, the family that donated that organ, the person that donated that organ, the family that consented to it, they did it for altruistic reasons because donation is about transforming loss into impact in the world, right? It's the most beautiful thing. I've been in the donation and transplant community for a long time, and I've seen mothers who have lost their children, lost her son, listen to his heartbeat in another man's chest who's alive and have 4 kids that she calls her grandkids. When we talk about collaboration and things that can bring us together, I think it's one of the absolute most powerful things. We heard the beautiful story yesterday about Mila and how the donation of her cells allowed us to prove it's possible to create a drug of one for one patient in less than a year, right? We also heard about the power of that story to bring us all together. I mean, we all felt it, right? So what we realized was that it wasn't just about our ability to accelerate. We were also able to engage care providers that enabled that donation and the family themselves by their donation helps drive this forward. Since then, I was a professor at Yale. We built the infrastructure to be able to support organ donation for research because that's really what it's about. Is you have to create the infrastructure for this now. So that's what we did at Yale, and then eventually we spun it out into the company. Where now, working with C-Path, working with academic partners, regulatory partners, we want to create a new infrastructure that we think we refer to as human data trials, which are about telling the full picture, telling the full story, because it feels like often, you're trying to interpret where we've ripped a bunch of pages out of the story. right? And how do we fix that? We've got to become way more human-centered from the beginning. And our belief, based on our experience, is that human organs donated for research have the capacity to act as a Rosetta Stone to integrate all these different data, because what they do is they come with medical history. You can put them on the pump and you can measure anatomy, physiology. You can treat with the drug, see how it responds. You can also take cells or take tissue slices, then go down to cells and create what we think of as the full human data stack, the entire stack of technologies of human data sources that could support better regulatory decision-making, better investment decision-making, better therapeutic development decision-making. And that's what's really unique about that as a platform.
Yeah, awesome. And I want to call on Ralf now, because Ralf did an exercise internally at EMA that was very eye-opening, because one of the novel advanced methods that was, in fact, the first one that was qualified by EMA was 10 years ago, the hollow fiber system model for tuberculosis. And Ralf took it upon himself of digging through EMA files, of finding how many times that model, after it was qualified, was used. And he found that it was being used not just for tuberculosis, but for many other indications. So I want you to comment on that, but I also want you to comment on the eye-opening bit that links to what Amitabh mentioned, the quiet innovation, and how that kind of needs to stop. We need to not be quiet anymore. And those types of exercises are eye-opening in that regard. Ralf.
Starting from the back, yes, I think this is also linking to what I said before, to make it more visible. I think we build on our stakeholders also to do this research, to do the interpretations, to paint the picture. It's certainly an aspect that we considered when we did a review of our conditional marketing authorization at the European Medicines Agency, but that was way back in 2016, and we would need to follow up. It also takes resources, but this is why we collaborate with external researchers and say, take our information, come and see if we can create that research. And that's an offering for everyone across the globe to approach us and suggest a research project on these topics, for example. Klaus, do you permit me also to say,
Please.
Since this is about the transformative power, and if I take your example that you represent with your activities and your learnings, I think we come over the past years to consider that we as regulators need to play our role in valorizing or contributing to the valorization of such inventions so that they become innovations. And we're trying to understand how we can do that. So we're welcoming these inventions to be discussed in various fora that we have, often low hurdle. And then we offer documents back to the innovators that they can use for attracting maybe investors and others. And we recognize this. Maybe we haven't formalized it in this way because that's not the economic trajectory is not our mission, of course, but there is the interface where it helps, where we could discuss the role in the transformed enterprise of evidence generation of that. And the hollow fiber, then, to finish up, is perhaps a good example of that, because my exercise was, I want to be able to answer such questions quickly, and that was an example. So we have set up ourselves to be able to answer such questions better. And it has turned out that more than half a dozen of anti-infectives, but also cancer medicines and others, have publicly mentioned that this system has been used. The idea, the invention has been used. It has inspired other uses, of course, beyond the qualified use. And Cécile talked about the life cycle and so on yesterday of drug development too. That's all perfect. But indeed, that is the case. There's a sparking point, and perhaps that's the regulatory interaction or the qualification, but much goes on, and we need to tell the story, as I said before, about the drug development tools. And I think this is where it's not just about publications, but we really have to find ways to explain how the drug development tools themselves materialize and help and assist better from our side. We have an effort on that that's starting in October.
Yes, yes. So stay tuned for the news in October. LaShell, let's get back to the human at the center of development. We talked yesterday about how to accelerate data sharing and data integration. You've seen how the efforts to make sure that you include the people that matter in the evidence generation enterprise. That also has a benefit for them to be more empowered to call on their data to be shared. Can you comment on your experience with that?
So I'll, so this what you just mentioned spoke to me. I'm going to kind of put on two hats here because I just recently went through about a breast cancer, right? But what was incredible about that is I also had the opportunity to be a clinical trial participant because the type of cancer that I had was rare. And we all know the statistics about African American women, a higher mortality rate, more aggressive form. So I didn't even fit in that. And so with the modeling that you're speaking about, that's why the importance of having different ways to test out medications in a diverse set or representative set becomes really, really important because I did not fit that model. And fortunately, clinical research could close that gap. In addition to that, it also humanized this process that I'm always speaking about when I'm talking to patients, when I'm talking to patient advocacy groups about why research is important. And so, even though it was not the best situation, right? It gave that practicality. So I really understood what it meant to actually try to find a clinical trial. So when I was faced with that, I knew exactly the tools to do. I went on clinicaltrials.gov. I tried to do all of the research, and I still kind of fell through the cracks. And at that moment, it really gave the genesis of, okay, what is this like for patients that I'm actually trying to make that connection with? And in Takeda, we had been really talking about building with communities as partners as we connect patients. How do we take our digital platform and all these innovations of trying to speed up drug development by providing education and access to a community that maybe would not want to hear about clinical research because of past issues, or maybe because it's not in the same language. It could even be because their doctor is not even addressing it. So there were a couple things that we realized. Only 3% of healthcare providers participate in clinical research. That right there is a gap. A patient is coming to their doctor asking about clinical research, and they may not even be able to explain the phases. So to your point, that education to healthcare providers, even about what clinical research is, the different innovations, as you just mentioned, becomes very, very critical. And so that's one of our areas that we're focusing on: equitable trial access program, healthcare providers, advanced practitioners. How can they close that gap? Even if they don't want to be involved in research, they should be knowledgeable about the process so that when a patient like myself says, hey, I'm interested in a clinical trial, they can directionally point me in the right direction. The other part too was also empowering patients. So we talked about how that is really, really critical because oftentimes we're seeing kind of the world change. Google is king for patients. That is usually the first place they're looking at. Unfortunately, sometimes even in Facebook groups or social, they're getting all of that information before they're coming to their doctor. Well, we need to be part of that continuum rather than running away from that. And so with this We Connect Patients platform, we are not only going to the community, but we're also developing this relationship. Patients can actually scan this QR code and sign up if they would like to receive information about clinical trials, but we're leading with education. So any of our events that we're showing up, we're saying we don't want to talk necessarily about a clinical trial. We want to just talk about clinical research, why it's important, how it is part of the medication that you take every single day. I usually start the question with how many of you take a medication? And of course, everybody raises their hand. And then I ask how many people have participated in clinical research, and it goes dead silent. Except for maybe the one person who was brave enough and hasn't even shared that they've participated in a trial because they're worried about stigma, they're worried about what people would think. But it also really shines a light that people disconnect those two processes when they are so connected. And so when we start talking about phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 and how safety is the underscore of every single aspect, and how we take those different phases and build on with knowledge. And as a trial participant, you are part of that continuum. You see people asking questions, wondering why they weren't included, how they find out more information. And what we've also seen too is we wanted to lead with education. We didn't want it to be branded with Takeda originally, but we talk about PTRP, patient trust, reputation, and business. And we saw that it started building trust, and people wanted to know more about what we were doing as a company, because if we were taking measures to just show up and provide education, then they wanted to be part of that journey too. So it's been a great, really continuum of showing how we take the digital, this kind of flat asset, connect communities, and give them access to that information so they can activate and be in charge of their own healthcare.
Yes, thank you for sharing your story, by the way. And I want to emphasize a couple points that you raised. The fact that the making sure that you listen to the people that are intended to participate in research makes them more interested in participating in research. And the fact that they see that they're not just a passive recipient of a test medication or a placebo, but that they're part of the entire evidence generation enterprise is key. The other point I want to emphasize is the notion that you mentioned about interacting with the people that, for some reason, don't meet the inclusion criteria, and how that has a potentially devastating effect on the human that gets rejected to participate in research, because they can still participate. Maybe they're not going to be enrolled to be randomized, but they still have a voice in that, and that's something that we cannot forget. Greg, you wanted to add a comment.
Thank you for sharing your journey. And the thing that I wanted to highlight in there too is the role of the care providers in this. So in my role at Yale when I was a professor, part of what I did aside from running my lab was trying to create supporting infrastructure for all of our clinical trials. We were running something like 100 different clinical trials in transplant when I was there. And the infrastructure that we had to support the ability to gather extra samples, I mean, it was nothing, right? And we were in the middle of the night, my poor students running around trying to grab these samples. And then that doesn't allow us to support, and especially if it's the wishes of the patient to be able to contribute, we have to have good infrastructure and support that also is going to generate data that you can rely on, right? So I think that's so critical. And then the other component that I would just add too is, one of my sort of frustrations, I think, as a scientist who came from a humanities background, was that I think so often we forget the incredible importance and power of good storytelling. It's amazing to have deep scientific evidence and credibility. We must have that. But then we have to think about how do we make that accessible? Right. And absent doing that, people fill that void, and it gives rise to a lot of fear and stuff. But I think the way to do that is to be a great storyteller, you start by building trust. Right. So I love to hear that that's what you guys are doing, is connecting, because you need to be a part of the community. You need to understand their language to be able to tell the story in a way that's accessible to them. So I think I just wanted to highlight those two things. I think it's exactly what we're seeing is, as we develop these new tools and infrastructure, it isn't just about how do we connect to the folks that would use them to develop drugs, the regulators. It's also really engaging the care providers in the process, because they are the source of the human data and tissues that will be contributing to this. Everyone I've met has an incredible workload. They have lots of burdens. They have publication. They have all these things that they have to do too. So as we build these tools, we have to make sure that both their needs are met in this process, and that they're educated so that they can be educating their patients. So I love that you guys are doing that work. That's fantastic.
Fantastic. Now, Teresa, I want to make sure that you also get a chance to highlight the patient-focused drug development angles that you've seen, and how the collaborations that we run facilitate that to make that a reality. That's number one. And then number two, how you've seen that actually providing tangible benefit in accelerating drug development and facilitating regulatory decision-making.
So patient-focused drug development has been something we've been talking about at the agency. I don't know when it started, but over a decade now. It's been there. It's been talked about as long as I've been there. So I was trained in the focus on patients, and so to me, it's odd to think that at some point in the past we weren't patient focused. I think we always need to be patient focused. We are engaged with patient groups in a variety of ways, with internal processes and also through C-Path as well. We do have patient listening sessions, which are informal meetings that we are able to have with patient groups to hear directly from patients about their experiences with the disease. It's not specific to any particular drug development program, but just an opportunity for patients to share experiences directly with the FDA. There are externally led patient-focused drug development meetings that are usually run by advocacy groups, coordinated with different companies or groups that have become expert in running these. We do try to attend those. They usually produce a voice of the patient report that we do read and incorporate into our regulatory advice. With public-private partnerships with C-Path, there is a patient element. Patient advocacy groups are part of the partnership. There may be individual patients as well. When we have these projects that come through with C-Path, the patient voice is integral to that process. They are there, they are able to provide input on the importance of work that we're doing or potential concerns with the work we're doing. It goes both ways. And so that really helps us keep the work that we're doing. I mean, to have a variety of stakeholders at the public-private partnerships with regulatory, government, academia, and industry and patient groups, make sure that we have good representation to cover everybody's interests and needs. And in particular, I think we've worked with most recent experience has been with ALS, where the CPR and Rare Neurodegenerative Disease group is working with also FNIH, and they have an AMP-ALS group. And we've been working together with both of those groups. There is a patient group as part of that has shared their experiences with the disease. And I think that's been very informative to us at the agency. We did fund a project on looking at the ALS-FRSR, which is one of the main scales used in ALS. And we will be hearing more about that, I think, in the next session. So I'm not going to say too much right now, but I will just say that input from patients helped us to understand the importance of being able to have standardized instruments that can be used both in person and in a decentralized way, that we were able to fund research and get some answers on whether a scale can be used remotely or not. So these do have practical implications for influencing us for our understanding of disease, given the regulatory advice that we give, and even projects that we might fund.
Yes, and I'll come back to that in a second, but Amitabh, let's wrap also the human in the story of the economic impact and how you've looked at how certain areas that are able to handle uncertainty in a way that doesn't become scary actually have a positive, not just for investment, but also for the impact of the whole ecosystem of healthcare.
So I think, yeah, there's a few things that I would like to share, but I think there's this observation that I wanted to make, which is an observation that I came to healthcare with, which was you often read about a medicine being approved and the poor incentives, especially in the US, to overuse that medicine in other patients. You often hear about that. And I'm sure that's probably true. I think the incentives that people are talking about is the fact that, like, for a lot of oncology drugs, a lot of infusion therapies, physicians are often paid like ASP plus 6%, which incents them to prescribe the more expensive drug. Now, one of the things that economists have always wondered about is regulation of the type done by the EMA and the FDA, is its primary goal just to certify the drug as being safe and effective, or is there an additional benefit to this certification? The additional benefit being, in the absence of the certification, people would not use the drug. So just think about that. So, like, I just don't know, right? That could be a reason that, like, well, if this drug is not FDA approved, it's not EMA approved, I'm just not going to learn about the drug. So that's an empirical question, right? Like, is how much do physicians and patients figure out about a drug if there was no FDA, if there was no EMA? And so what we did, and when I say we, I mean me and Ben Berger, who's an FDA employee, did together, was that we looked at a bunch of great drugs. And when I say great drugs, I'm an economist, so great drugs tend to be like drugs that made a lot of money, right? So, Humira is a great drug. And Humira is clinically a great drug as well. Revlimid is a great drug, economically as well as in terms of what it's done to patients. Now, you take a drug like Humira, it gets an approval for rheumatoid arthritis, I think it was like December 31st, 2002. That was the first approval for Humira. And then something like 4 years later, it gets an approval for Crohn's, which is another very, very big indication. So suppose we thought that, like, doctors, hospitals, insurers, and patients could figure out the value of Humira in Crohn's before the indication in Crohn's is given. What would you see? You would see the approval in rheumatoid arthritis, and then you would see a bunch of use in Crohn's, so that when the indication comes to Crohn's, maybe there's an uptick, but it's very, very small. And the answer is important because it tells us how conservative patients are, how conservative families are, how conservative doctors are, in part because the doctors who are treating Crohn's are not the doctors treating RA. And they might not know about this great drug in RA that could work for Crohn's as well. Patients are desperate, but the patients are not doctors, right? And the patients are not AbbVie. So they don't know any of these things. So it turns out that in general, even in great drugs, when the next indication comes, there is a discontinuous uptake in the use of the drug of about 25%. It's huge, suggesting that doctors and patients and insurers and society are actually very conservative. They're actually very, very conservative. And what that also means is regulation, the act of giving one more indication, is a benefit to the sponsor because now you're selling more drugs. So it's not only a benefit to the patient and the family, it's a benefit to the sponsor. So this kind of turns on its head this thinking that the FDA, the EMA is just like, it's just like a speed bump. We'd be driving at 80 miles an hour, now there's a speed bump, so I got to slow down to 40. No, it's completely different. It's saying without the imprimatur of the approval, the industry would actually be smaller, even in the setting of great drugs. Now, if you go to smaller drugs, the effect is even bigger because there's going to be less experimentation. Right. And so what we find in our research is the industry, when I say the industry, I mean like doctors, patients are quite good at figuring out whether something that's been approved third line should be used second line or first line. They figured that out. What they're not good at doing is we approve the drug in multiple myeloma, but there's other cancers that are not multiple myeloma quite far away from multiple myeloma where we don't learn until the indication comes along. So this, to your question about uncertainty, there is profound uncertainty. Patients are desperate, and the signals, the imprimatur of approval actually helps patients, and in this case also helps the manufacturer. And so that's something that has to be preserved. I mean, just to make it say the obvious, if we sort of dial down the importance of these trials, actually that shrinks the industry. The industry will be smaller.
Yes, and that's such a fantastic point because the FDA and the EMA are at the center of a lot of innovations. And those innovations are important to industry, obviously, but they're also important to society and the human beings that we make up that society that ultimately stands to benefit from those processes. We have about 16 minutes left, so this is the time to open it up for questions from the audience. We have 2 standing mics, but we also have people that can come to you with a microphone for questions. Yes, Karen, we're going to get you your mic in 30 seconds. That's great. So yeah.
Thank you. So, hi, Amitabh.
Hi,
I was
Karen.
thinking about you the other day. So I want to tie together, I think, something Amitabh just said with something that LaShell said earlier. And I think part of this comes out of the fact that I've been writing about drugs and patients for almost 40 years, and partly from personal experience because my sister had AML. And I think that, to Amitabh's comment, this is really about understanding the drug target, right? And most physicians do not keep up on the literature, and certainly most patients have no clue, right? And to LaShell's comment, there's a lot that I think about here, a lot from my personal experience. It's not just the patients, it's patient advocates. When people are sick, they are in no position to do the kind of research required to understand their treatment or alternative treatments. And their immediate families aren't either. My sister, when she was sick, her husband was catatonic. I flew in and stayed there as long as needed. But I also know the industry, so I know where to look and what research to do and who to reach out to get that done. And HMOs, where my sister was, are totally protocol focused. They don't care about alternatives. They're uninterested in them. And as a patient advocate, you really have to push them hard to get them to do something out of their protocol. You know, in my sister's case, it was you'll get chemo and then you'll die. Literally, that's what she was told. And I was like, no, that's not how this is gonna work. And I would walk into a room and they'd go, oh, you must be the sister. And I was like, you bet. Right. But I wanted to ask you a question, LaShell, that I think about a lot because primary care centers have no clue how to run clinical
100%.
trials. There's no training. The nurses aren't trained. The doctors aren't trained. The patients often are not as compliant as they might be at tertiary care centers, or forced to be as compliant as they might be at tertiary care centers. So how do you guys at Takeda sort of deal with that kind of education? Because sponsors don't want a trial to be ruined, right? So there's a disincentive to go outside of tertiary care. So how do you sort of get to those places which have a lot of patients and make those trials work?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to acknowledge that I pretty much had the exact same experience. I had to almost shake off the diagnosis because I was the researcher and really advocate for myself for all those reasons. We could probably go on and on about the similar experiences. But back to your point about primary care. So it really dawned on me during the COVID-19 vaccine trials when I was conducting them with another company that I worked at, when somebody that was doing, a doctor that was doing all of this abundance of testing. And we had her come in to speak to the company about just the importance of what she was seeing, boots on the ground, almost from that healthcare provider perspective. And when we asked her about the vaccine, the response was, you do it first. And it shocked me. I said, I mean, I literally, that's probably the face I made because I couldn't believe that I'm almost sitting next to a healthcare provider that also doesn't necessarily trust the system that we're making drugs for, and she's doing testing. Like, wow, how many other physicians does this apply to? So speed forward to being at Takeda, one of those areas was educating healthcare providers. And what we started with, even if you don't want to be in research, because for some of them, especially primary care, they're also worried about patient flow. They're also worried about not only are they seeing a lot of patients, but they're also in cases where they're in a rural area being that substitute for a specialist, because oftentimes specialists are not in rural areas. So I'm sensitive to that. But can you just be part of this system where you are actually learning about clinical research and are okay with referring your patients or making them aware? And so that equitable trial access program has really been specifically for that, to provide education. Again, we actually have key rings that we actually provide them. And then eventually, my hope is that they'll get so interested in the process that they will again want to participate in clinical research. But it's almost like I don't want to call it pre-consent, but it's one of those aspects where they're talking to the patient about what a clinical research trial is and the very, very basics. So not only are they educating themselves, but they're educating the patient and they're getting familiar with the clinical research process. They're not participating, but they are in that continuum. And so that's one of the areas that we've really been working on. Now, the challenge, as you can imagine, contracting, budgeting. I always say it's never for lack of willingness for healthcare providers. It's always in that infrastructure where we kind of get caught up. And so right now we're literally working through that with trying to do that with healthcare providers. We've had great success with doing that with pharmacists. They are probably the most accessible healthcare providers. And so we're trying to like replicate that system even with advanced practitioners. Any person that will see a patient should be knowledgeable about clinical research. And I think that will help close that gap. So that's where we've been focused the last 2 years.
Greg.
Yeah, just add a quick comment on that. It's such a great question. I also have been that journey of when the reason I'm not a musician is because my body stopped working and my hands were going numb, and I'm 25 years old and the doctors are telling me, no, you're fine. I'm like, I'm not fine. And I couldn't figure it out, and so, but and like it resonates so much is because, and I've been there, care for loved ones at end of life when, luckily I have the background and I could go through and interpret and find options, and it's so that's not the same at all for anyone. But I want to talk about this sort of like these primary centers and being able to like reach out. We built, in partnership with LifeShare of Oklahoma, is a really pioneering organ procurement organization, a program in Oklahoma to be able to offer donation to patients with lung cancer. Oklahoma is one of the hardest hit in the country for lung cancer, and that wasn't an option for them before. So we built this program so that they could have that if they so choose, so that then we could, create a new way to test drugs and living organs with tumors. But the most impactful part of this was we didn't just go to the large academic centers. We also went to the community health centers because organ donation was happening everywhere. And that was a workflow that they were used to. So it was a part of their clinical every day. And then what I would do is I would go into small community hospitals and I would share with them what we're doing. And I would just do these education forums and I would, get excited about being a part of innovation. It's just not something that's a part of their everyday, but what is a part of their everyday is feeling frustrated when they lose a patient and they have no autonomy. There's no way to make it better. And it puts so much strain on those care providers to just day after day after day march in and execute those protocols knowing it's not going to be the right thing. Right. And so, I remember one time in particular just saying, laying all this out of what we thought this cancer donation program could do. And it brings them, puts them at the absolute point of the spear of innovation. And I'm like, and it starts in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that room of ICU nurses was ready to get up and run through walls. But it came from a place where it was part of what they were doing every day, just with a little tweak. And it just became a part of the education. And I think that builds a bridge towards, hey, why couldn't we do a clinical trial here? And so it has to be sort of incremental, but exponential in terms of how we bring people along that journey.
Not have things not be a chore, but an incentive.
You have to return value back to them. You have to understand that what they want to be is, as a care provider, is someone that is there and able to make things better.
Yes.
That's kind of what I wanted to add. So we knew from healthcare providers that we necessarily couldn't just ask them to stop seeing patients. So the plan is to integrate it in their natural discussions. And we are able to, I'm trying to use my words carefully, compensate for the time it will take for them to learn the process. That's the only way we're going to provide that activation. And kind of back to your earlier point, having people within the healthcare infrastructure that are knowledgeable about research that can also do that mentorship becomes extremely important. So my breast oncologist was not interested in research. I looked for an oncologist that was interested in research, and that was my goal. And what was amazing about that is, you're right, he was going down the normal protocol. But when I stopped him and said, hey, what does the data say? Because I could talk data to him. There's no data about a person that is 41 years old that has this particular type of oncotype, et cetera, et cetera. There's no data. So the protocol you're telling me I don't fit. How can we have that conversation? And so in the vein of that, I also apply that to clinical research when I'm now speaking with community. Why can't a clinical research trial be for me? And going again back to your earlier point, I heard about the drug development process. It was very, very interesting because I had a discussion with our regulatory partners about not mentioning that other diseases were approved for a certain indication. And I said, can I just suggest something? That maybe hearing that this medication is approved for plaque psoriasis, RA, and now we're doing it in another area, maybe it's not coercive. Maybe it actually builds trust, because now we have 10,000 patients here for this particular drug. We have 5,000 here. Have you ever thought about it like that? And so part of our role, in our trial equity space, is also to really think about how we can look at it from a patient lens rather than from that rigidness and providing that patient lens. So I wanted to kind of really hone in on that because a lot of patients don't realize that at all.
Yeah. Thank you. Carly, you've been so patient.
Yeah, sure. So I am a researcher, but I'm also a clinical neurologist. And I wanted to comment on Dr. Chandra's last statement, because as I'm listening to you talking about, new drugs and how do we get to prescribe them for a different indication in our clinics, the piece of the equation that I didn't really hear was the payer. And the payer's not in this room, I don't think. And I may understand that this would be a great drug for this particular treatment. My patient may be very eager to receive this particular treatment, but unless they're independently wealthy with huge resources, they probably can't afford it unless there's a payer who says yes. And that's where the indication becomes really, really important. And even just to add to this. When there is an indication, often we have to go through 2 other drugs that we really don't think is the right drug for that patient. We want to give them this new drug, but we can't until we have these other trials. So just to comment to this group that maybe there is a missing partner in this room, and maybe there's a way we can think about creatively engaging payers so that we can get drugs to patients faster when they're really good drugs.
The evolution of the partnerships, yes, Carly, and bringing in those stakeholders, yes. I think you were standing before, so I'll give you the mic now.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Pratik from Genentech Roche. I had a question for Ralf and for Teresa. We heard a lot about
Speak up, please.
Oh, sure. My name is Pratik from Genentech Roche, and I was just listening to the patient's perspective all day yesterday and even now on the stage, and just wondering what are reviewers doing to kind of incorporate that into the data, for review, so that we, into the data package itself, and how can companies do something better to get that in there?
I can start. So throughout the drug development process and our interactions with companies as they're, during development before they even submit an application, we have the formal meeting process. We do have occasions where companies will bring patients to the meetings to educate us. That does happen. But, the patient engagement should be happening very early on. It should be happening from the initial conception of what the drug development program is going to look like. And so that should be incorporated into, the earliest pre-IND meetings, type C meetings, et cetera, throughout the process, so that the goal is that when we get to an NDA or BLA submission, that's not the first time we're considering the patient's perspective. However, when we do get to that point, we do consider that as part of the data package that we're reviewing. We even have in our review template documents some check boxes of, what was their patient experience data submitted in the package, and we do look through that and document what we considered as part of our review. But I think the overall message here is it should be happening very early on and through the development process.
Ralf?
Yes, so we similarly have that visible in the final output. And going back to the beginning, we encourage developers to document how they work with patients, with patient organizations, healthcare professionals in the regulatory submission documents eventually. Think of ICH E8R1 that calls for critical factors that include the patient engagement, and that needs to be described in the documents themselves. And so that's an important aspect. And I think another one is a big opportunity on your heading here on the practical innovations. We now have the ICH E22, the patient preference studies there, and this is a very clear way, almost an experimental way. It's a complementary study type in the evidence generation system that really we should bring in the private-public partnerships experience to shape that guidance to hit very well. I think it's a formal way to ask patients, and for patients, it's important to have choices and options, and these studies allow to express these options. It's not about just, is there a trial, do I want or not participate? It's really about their values and options. I think that's the corresponding to the ethical suggestion and requirement we have to give patients autonomy, and that therefore is important as a consideration here. So thank you for the question, really nice one in multiple ways. Just a final remark, at the European Medicines Agency, we mostly work with around 50 healthcare professional working organizations, learned societies, etc. They are our middlemen, our multipliers for these operational models, healthcare influence that you work in, and similar number of patient organizations and consumer organizations. And for us, this is a very efficient and effective way to learn, but also to help them understand. And so we can't talk to every healthcare provider, but they do. And I think they are very much taking up this role very seriously. The next meeting is just in 2 weeks, and I'm sure we'll report back on what we discussed here.
Great. We have less than a minute left, so any closes out?
Sorry. So many complex ideas here. I just wanted to also reinforce another missing player of the nonprofits that are trying to do things like direct-to-participant registries, as well as healthcare provider education. Because when we want to empower people wherever they happen to be and give them those ethical options to make their own decisions about where they might do, we can't expect a given clinician. Many of them can't even accurately diagnose many of these conditions if they're in rural settings and they're not that specialist. And we can't expect a given company who's focused, as they should be, on their programs and their assets, and may or may not even stay in that one disease area long term. We need to be getting people to come into the trusted nonprofit resources that can then connect them to the opportunities that are there and be there as a resource, giving value back to those families for the long haul. And I will also just echo what Carly had also said about payers with what Amitabh had said, because we see so much that the evidence generation needs to continue after these drugs are on the market. And the innovation can't stop there. And it does in part because payers won't cover things if it's not part of the central indication, and even more so if it's not the cheapest drug amongst those indications. Thank you so much for a fascinating session.
Thank you, Penny. Okay, Amita, yes, I cannot say no to you.
You cannot say no to me. The reason he can't say no to me, I'm C-Path's liaison from Cedar at the FDA. And I just have worked with C-Path for many, many years. So I'm Amitabh. Thanks, Klaus. So I'm going back to that amazing example, Chandra, Amitabh, you shared. And I'm putting a slightly different angle on it. Carly, you brought up the angle of who's going to pay for it. It's too pricey. Another piece that Ralf, you mentioned, totally independent of this example, was you are EMA, you work with IMI, IHI. We have worked with IMI, IHI. We work with you as well. So that's another international PPP piece. Yesterday, someone mentioned we have all these PPPs, but we need to work together. Connecting the dots has been the theme of this meeting so far, and it should be for a lot of things. A great example that comes to my mind is Friedreich's ataxia drug, connecting the dots, piecing everything together, and what resulted was something really beneficial for the patient. Going back to, Amitabh, your example of Humira, it was approved for this indication, but people knew it can work for Crohn's. So they were using it, but cautiously. Who was losing out? Patients were losing out. And we are talking, Teresa, you talked about PFDD. We are all really focusing on PFDD. I'm going to connect all these dots. And I'm going to ask you or challenge you, can PPPs across the pond take on some action item from these examples and say, okay, let's get the pairs together, let's have a dedicated meeting, and let's find out how we can. Repurposing is something that, pharma companies say, ouch, we don't want to repurpose our drugs. But this is repurposing, and plant the seed and somehow have it launched and take off, because I know there are people at the FDA who are interested in repurposing. So if PPPs across the pond can come together and create something that's amazing, I'm sure there'll be a lot of momentum behind it. So.
Yes, thank you, Amita. And we'll do the work so that this time next year, we're going to be reporting on that, not just getting the people together. Back to Julia's point from yesterday, these meetings are great, but it's not the end goal. This is for reporting out on the work that happens. Okay.